Okay, so I have a question for you. When you think about the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, the history of ancient Israel, what genre do you file that under in your head?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, for most people, it's scripture. It's a religious text.
Right. Theology, ancient history, maybe?
Yeah, it's about God, morality, rituals, that kind of thing.
Okay. But what if? What if I told you that for a very specific, very influential group of thinkers back in the 17th century, the Bible wasn't just a religious book?
Okay.
What if they read it as the ultimate political handbook, a literal blueprint for how to build a perfect federal republic?
Now you're talking about the era of political Hebraism.
I am. We are doing a deep dive today into a text that, honestly, I didn't even know existed until recently. It's called the Hebrew Republic, or, if you want to be fancy, De Republica Hebreorum.
It was written in 1617 by a guy named Petrus Cuneus.
Exactly.
And Cuneus is such a fascinating figure to anchor this whole discussion. He wasn't a rabbi or a theologian in the traditional sense. He was a Christian scholar, a jurist, a professor at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands.
And to really get this book, you have to get the moment he was writing it.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's set the scene a little. 1617, the Netherlands, the United Provinces, as they were called, they're in a really weird spot.
A very dangerous spot, I'd say. They had just pulled off this successful revolt against the Spanish Empire, which was, the superpower of the day, so they had their independence.
Now what?
Exactly. The now what phase. They were dealing with total internal chaos. You have religious factions, political infighting between the different provinces, big questions about state power versus church power. The whole Dutch Republic was incredibly fragile.
It sounds a lot like the early days of the United States. You kick out the king, but now you have to figure out how to not argue yourselves into oblivion.
That's a perfect parallel. Yeah. And Cuneus writes this book not as some dry history lesson, but as a warning. He's basically grabbing the Dutch leaders by the shoulders and saying, look at the ancient Israelites. They had the perfect federal system designed by God himself, and then look how they blew it.
And that is the lens for this deep dive. We're going to try to put the theology aside for a minute and just look at the political science of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right.
And ask, did the ancient Hebrew system of judges and tribes actually inspire modern republicanism?
It's the United States of Israel.
I love that. So let's unpack the structure, because when I read, say, the Book of Judges or Joshua, I just see a list of tribes. Reuben, Simeon, Judah, all of them. I see a lot of chaotic warfare. I don't immediately see a federal state.
No, but Cuneus does.
Yeah.
He approaches the 12 tribes as a jurist, as a legal scholar.
Okay.
And he breaks them down as, effectively, 12 distinct nations or states, all living within one larger border. He points out that they were incredibly fertile, populous, powerful. Each tribe had its own territory, its own local identity.
But they didn't just go off and do their own thing.
That's the key. They didn't try to set up individual fiefdoms. He says they defended the people's liberty by sticking together.
Even though they had their own boundaries, right? Like modern American states.
Exactly. Distinct borders.
Okay.
But Cuneus describes the entire Confederacy with this really beautiful phrase. He calls it one unified city.
One unified city, even though they're spread out all over the place, not enclosed by the same walls.
Precisely. It's a
Right.
conceptual city.
Yeah.
And that leads to the big question. What held them together? If I'm a guy from the tribe of Dan way up north, why do I care about a guy from Benjamin down south? Why not just form the Kingdom of Dan and call it a day?
The federal bond.
A federal bond.
Yeah.
Cuneus points out they shared the same laws, the same magistrates. They used the same weights, the same measures, the same currency.
So it's like the interstate commerce clause.
Very similar. Or like the European single market. You have distinct states, but a unified economic and legal operating system. A merchant from Asher could go to Judah and know exactly what a shekel was worth.
Okay, but a common market isn't enough to stop a civil war. We know that from history.
Right. Cuneus argues that the real genius of the Hebrew Constitution was the binding center, Jerusalem.
And this is so important. He argues Jerusalem wasn't designed as a place of domination. It wasn't that Jerusalem ruled the other tribes like an empire.
No, not at all. He calls it a binding center. The law demanded that all male citizens had to gather there 3 times a year for the major festivals: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles.
Cuneus sees this as a brilliant political mechanism.
It is. It's not just religious observance, it's nation building.
Imagine if the U.S. Constitution required every eligible voter from Texas, California, and New York to physically gather in D.C. for a week 3 times a year just to eat together.
It would be a total logistical nightmare, but it would certainly change the political tone, wouldn't it? It's really hard to demonize the guy from the other state if you're passing him the brisket.
That's his exact point.
And he draws a parallel here to the ancient Greek Achaean League. He says that the Romans, they knew that these federal structures are rock solid as long as the members trust in their unity. The only way to break them is to sow internal discord.
So the festivals were the mechanism to manufacture that trust.
Yes, which is a huge warning for the Dutch in 1617, who were doing the exact opposite, retreating into their own little provincial bubbles.
And for any federal republic, really, the moment the parts stop trusting the whole, the clock starts ticking.
It does.
So we have the states, the tribes, we have the federal capital, Jerusalem. Let's talk about the government itself, because Cneius uses a word that sounds very, very familiar to modern ears.
The Senate?
The Senate. He focuses heavily on the Great Sanhedrin, which he basically equates to a Senate.
Right, this body of 71 elders and magistrates. And what's fascinating is how Cneius views the balance of power. He goes to Jewish sources like Maimonides and Josephus to argue that the Hebrew government wasn't just a simple monarchy.
So it wasn't just what the king says goes.
Not at all. In fact, Cneius argues it was closer to an aristocracy or a republic where the law was supreme. He points out that even if there was a king, the king couldn't act without the high priest and, well, the Senate.
Checks and balances. 17th century stuff.
Absolutely, checks and balances.
Yeah.
Cneius notes the king couldn't just declare an offensive war on a whim. There were procedures. The Sanhedrin had to be consulted. If the king wanted to expand the kingdom's territory, he needed the Senate's approval.
I found this part really interesting because it feels like Cneius is writing a mirror for princes. You know, one of those old books that tells rulers how not to be a tyrant.
Yes, he is 100% speaking directly to the Dutch leadership.
And he talks about superbia, arrogance. He says the downfall of all rulers is when they start to place themselves above the citizens.
And he uses this really specific, kind of surprising example to prove that the office was always more important than the man.
Oh, the thing with the high priest on the Day of Atonement?
Ah, yes. The substitute priest. I love this detail.
Tell us about that, because to me, the high priest sounds like the most essential person in the nation.
He is. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is the holiest day of the year. The high priest has to perform these very specific, crucial rituals. He is the only one allowed in the Holy of Holies. If he messes up, the whole nation is in trouble.
Right.
But Cneius finds this note, I think he's citing the Talmud, that they would actually designate a substitute priest. They'd arrange another one to stand in the wings just in case.
Just in case the high priest, became ritually impure or suddenly died the night before?
Exactly. And Cneius loves this. For him, it proves that the system is bigger than any one individual. Even the most powerful, divinely anointed figure in the nation isn't indispensable. If he's not fit for the role, you swap him out because the function of the office must continue.
That is such a Republican idea. A nation of laws, not of men. It reminds me of the vice presidency or the chain of succession.
Precisely. And he's writing this to the states of Holland. He's telling them, don't let your leaders get arrogant. The law is the state. The machinery matters more than the operator.
Okay, so we have this perfect system, a divine constitution, federal unity, a Senate checking the king's power. But we know how the story ends. The United States of Israel didn't last.
The Great Divorce.
Israel splits. 10 tribes in the north, 2 in the south, and Cneius asks the big question. If this system was designed by God, what went wrong?
And here is where it gets really interesting for political science geeks. Cneius doesn't just say, oh, they sinned and God punished them. I mean, he does say that, but he analyzes the mechanism of the split.
He focuses on Jeroboam.
Right, the guy who led the secession of the 10 tribes. Now, usually in Sunday school, you hear about Jeroboam making golden calves and leading people into idolatry. It's framed as a religious failure.
But Cneius looks at it and says,
no, this was a political coup.
He weaponized religion.
He absolutely did. I mean, think about what we just said. What was this thing holding the union together?
Going to Jerusalem, the binding center.
Exactly. Jeroboam is now the king of the north. He has this problem. He realizes that as long as his subjects are traveling south to Jerusalem for the festivals, their hearts will eventually turn back to the house of David. They'll reunite. The federal bond will hold.
So he has to cut that bond.
He has to. So Cneius explains that Jeroboam corrupted the true religion with new superstitions, the golden calves, specifically to enforce political separation. He built new altars in Dan and Bethel so his people wouldn't need to go. He literally told them, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods."
That's incredibly cynical. It's like closing the border and creating state-run media to keep people from seeing what's happening on the other side.
It's Machiavellian. He used civil conflict to create a separate state. And Colonies quotes this line, "Harmony makes small things grow large, and disharmony makes great ones collapse."
And that is the warning to the Dutch.
Yes. He tells them explicitly, internal factionalism is more dangerous to a republic than any foreign enemy. He lists the Romans, the Spanish. None of them can destroy a republic as effectively as the republic can destroy itself.
The classic, a house divided against itself cannot stand. But he's showing how the house gets divided.
Right. It's when you let ambition and faction override the federal constitution. And Colonies notes that once that split happened, the clock was ticking. The 10 tribes were wiped out by the Assyrians. Judah lasted longer, but they were never the same.
So we've talked about the political structure and how it broke, but I want to pivot to something else Colonies really geeks out on, the Constitution itself, or rather how it was preserved.
The text of the Bible.
Yeah. He goes into this deep dive on the Masoretes. Who even were they?
So the Masoretes were these Jewish scribes who lived centuries after the temple was destroyed, and their whole job was just to preserve the text of the Hebrew Bible. Colonies is completely obsessed with their diligence.
He says they didn't just copy the words, they counted them.
They counted everything. They knew how many verses were in a book, how many words. They even knew the middle letter of the entire Pentateuch. Colonies calls this the fence, or the walled enclosure, for the law.
Why does a political theorist care about counting letters?
Because it ensures that the Constitution can't be amended by accident or by malicious actors. He says that thanks to the Masoretes, not a single mark was lost, despite the Jews being exiled, the temple being burned, all of it.
It's like an early form of a blockchain or a checksum. You're verifying the data integrity.
Exactly. If you change one letter, the count is off, and you know the text is corrupt.
And there's a really interesting tension here in the source material because Colonies is a Christian scholar in 1617. He doesn't exactly have a high opinion of contemporary Judaism, does he?
No, and we have to be honest about the text. Colonies holds what we'd call supersessionist views. He believes that after the coming of the Messiah, the Jewish nation sort of lost its divine mandate. He talks about them eating lentils and crying over their lost birthright. He can be pretty harsh.
He calls their characters slavish at one point, blaming it on their loss of liberty under the Romans.
He does. But, and this is the fascinating contradiction of the man, he also scolds Christians who disrespect the Jews. He says Christians owe them a huge debt.
Because they kept the book safe.
Exactly. He points out that early church fathers like Augustine didn't even know the Hebrew alphabet. So if the Jews hadn't meticulously preserved the text with those fences and counts, Colonies argues the Bible would be full of errors. So he has this begrudging, deep respect for their stewardship of the Constitution.
It's like he respects the political machine they built and the archive they kept, even if he thinks the spirit has left the building.
That's a very good way to put it. He treats the Hebrew Republic as this historical masterpiece that tragically ended, but one that absolutely demands study.
Let's move to the final piece of this puzzle then, international relations. Because if you're a republic, you have to deal with your neighbors, and that usually means war.
Right. And Colonies finds a very early form of just war theory in the Hebrew sources, and he relies heavily on Maimonides again.
He distinguishes between two types of war.
The mandatory war and the voluntary war.
Okay, unpack that, because when a lot of modern readers look at the Bible, especially the conquest of Canaan, they see, well, genocide, a command to wipe people out.
They do. And Colonies addresses that head on. That's the mandatory war, the war against the 7 Canaanite nations. And Colonies explains this by saying those nations had violated natural law.
Natural law.
Yeah, this idea that there are certain universal rules that bind all of humanity, not just Jews. They're sometimes called the Noahide laws, prohibitions against things like incest, bloodshed, idolatry.
So he frames it as a legal execution rather than a conquest.
Correct. Colonies argues the Canaanites were so depraved, so unnatural in their behavior, that their destruction was a form of divine justice. But, and this is the crucial but, he says that was a one-time thing, an exception.
So what about everyone else? What if the Hebrew Republic wanted to fight, say, the Moabites?
That's a voluntary war. And this is where Colonies sees a model for civilized international law. He notes that in a voluntary war, you can't just attack. You must offer peace first.
You have to offer terms.
Yes. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 20. If the other city accepts the terms and opens its gates, you can't kill them. You can't destroy the city. Cunius is showing that the Hebrew Republic wasn't a barbarian horde. It had rules of engagement.
It's fascinating how he's trying to thread this needle. He wants the Dutch Republic to be strong, but moral in how it conducts itself.
And remember, Cunius was legal counsel for maritime affairs for the states of Holland. He was dealing with real international disputes. So when he writes about natural law and laws of war, he's not just philosophizing. He's looking for precedents to apply to Dutch policy.
So what does this all mean? We've got a Dutch guy in the 1600s looking back at a Middle Eastern confederacy from 1000 BC to save his own country from civil war.
It sounds like a bit of a stretch when you say it like that, but it's actually a testament to how influential the Hebrew Bible was on political thought for centuries.
It wasn't just a storybook.
No. For Cunius, the Hebrew Republic was a sophisticated federal republic. It had checks and balances, a senate, a strong central binding mechanism that respected the diversity of its parts. It's a proto-model for the American experiment in so many ways.
And it failed.
And it failed.
Yeah.
And that is the most important part of the book for him. It didn't fail because the Romans were too strong or the Babylonians were brilliant. It failed because of internal factionalism.
Jeroboam. Yeah.
But really, the spirit of division. Cunius emphasizes that a republic survives only as long as its diverse parts, whether that's tribes or provinces or states, value their union more than their separate ambitions.
Teach that trust in the unity.
Yeah.
Once that's gone, once you start building your own altars to keep people from meeting their neighbors, the game is over.
Harmony makes small things grow large. That's the quote to remember.
It's amazing how relevant that feels. We think of church and state separation as a modern idea, but here's Cunius using the Bible to argue for political structures that prevent tyranny.
He helps us see that the Judges era wasn't just a religious period. It was an experiment in governance. And he wants us to learn from the data of that experiment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with that image of the 12 tribes. 12 distinct nations, no walls between them, acting as one city. It's a beautiful ideal.
It is. And Cunius leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. He suggests that a nation's night, its downfall, comes from within its own spirit.
Right. They bring their own night with them wherever they go.
Exactly. He says if the Hebrew Republic, which was designed by God himself, could fall due to partisanship and arrogance, what does that say about the fragility of our modern human-designed political systems?
That is a thought to chew on. If the divine blueprint can crack, ours certainly can too.
Eternal vigilance, as they say.
Indeed. Well, that's it for this deep dive into Petrus Cunius and the United States of Israel. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.